in a manner that ensures all members of the project team are performing their roles ethically as well. Now this includes the general contractor, architect, subcontractors, and everyone else from the owner to the laborers in the field. At the end of this training, you'll walk away with a wealth of management tools to help you lead others who are both below or above you in rank. And this is professional training, not a sermon. So this training will not be a philosophical discussion on things such as bid shopping, taking bribes, or exchanging change order approvals for football tickets. And throughout this presentation, we won't simply discuss what common unethical acts are. We will address how to proactively manage our projects and our careers to avoid them. We'll go through a series of real-life examples, one after the other, that each of us has or will encounter during our careers. The key lessons you will take away from this training session include gaining a good understanding of the individual perspectives of each project team member. Again, we'll address the perspectives of each project team member from the owner to the laborer in the field. Now this is a neutral presentation, so to be fair, we will examine all sides of each ethical example that's presented here. At the end of this training, you will walk away with an array of management tools to help ensure the other members of your project team perform their roles in an ethical manner. If you truly strive to rise above the unethical activities in the business world, these tools will become second nature to you as you progress through your career. You will also learn tools and tricks to help you not only handle, but also control the situation when confronted with an ethical dilemma. Okay, let's get rolling with the training. Ethics is an eclectic topic, so to avoid jumping too sporadically between examples, this training has been organized into 6 different segments, with each segment representing the perspective of the project team member who has the most control over the given situation. The segments will be as follows: the general contractor, the subcontractors, the construction workers themselves, the architect, the design subconsultants, and finally, the owner and construction manager. To help provide a consistent flow to this training, each topic will be presented from the primary perspective of the construction manager. Because it's the construction manager's job to pull the entire team together, including the design professionals, contractor, and even the owner, it makes the most sense to center around the CM's role for the purposes of this presentation. Now, I call this the primary perspective because it will not by any means be the only perspective addressed. This approach is taken for clarity of discussion only. This training is as beneficial to general contractors, owners, and architects as it is to the CMs themselves. Okay, we'll start with the general contractor. Among many other things, these guys are relied on for proactive project management, a good safety program, diligent quality control, and, of course, fair and equitable change order pricing. The general contractor is expected to provide a sufficient number of staff members with appropriate experience levels to run the project and provide effective leadership throughout the bidding and construction phases. Okay, let's move on to our first example. Let's come out of the gate hitting some contentious issues head on. We'll begin our training by analyzing some of the negative stereotypes directed towards general contractors. On negotiated projects, general contractors always have nuggets hidden in their estimates. Nuggets are essentially pockets of money buried in the estimate. And these nuggets may be unnecessary additional line items, or they might be inflated line items. For instance, a GC estimator might include a budget in his estimate for installation of door frames, but intentionally double cover this work by having the framing subcontractors included in their scope of work as well. The framing subcontractor will then install all the door frames, and the GC will keep the money in their budget without having to perform the work. Or a GC might include a budget that is sufficient to cover dumpsters for all the subcontractors, but then tell each sub to include money for dumpsters in their bids. And when reviewing the GC's estimate, the construction manager will see line items for door frame installation and dumpsters. They'll acknowledge that those are necessary items of work and fair values, but never realize that this work has been double covered. Now this is primarily because each subcontract value is typically reflected as only a single line item in the GC's estimate.
Many times when you're a construction manager looking at this, he requires that the contractor break down his bid into a schedule of values. So it's not that he's got the guy's estimate in front of him and he's going through and looking at all that stuff. He's got a line item that says doors or flooring or something like that. So that's what they're referring to in their review.
The reality is that some general contractors do in fact hide nuggets in their estimates. But please give GCs as a group the benefit of the doubt and assume that most of them do not. Now, for a lump sum bid, the bidders are trying to cut their costs as low as possible to win the job. So adding these nuggets to their estimate is not in their best interest. This isn't something we need to be concerned with for lump sum bidding. However, negotiated contracts are a concern. In the case of a negotiated contract, the GC already has the job, so it's in their best financial interest to negotiate as high of a contract price as possible. This is when we really need to keep an eye out for these nuggets. The first step to managing this issue is
I gotta tell you, I used to do this all the time, and so did all my friends who were estimating. It's part of the market. So as a CM, you have to be aware of this and try and root it out.
obviously to employ a reputable general contractor. However, keep in mind that nuggets are hidden by individual project managers and estimators, not by a company or as a company policy. Adding nuggets is of course never going to be a written company policy. Even though we may have had great experiences with the general contractor in the past, we need to remember that the people we're entrusting for the day-to-day decision-making on this new project are, in the most cases, not the same team that we worked with before. Those individual people are brand new to us. The second step in managing this issue is for the CM to thoroughly review both the general contractor's estimate and the subcontractor's scopes of work. They need to use their expertise to identify any inflated or unnecessary line items. Now, this is nothing really new, and there are no tricks to this, but there are a couple things worth mentioning. It's important that an experienced person does this review. Don't pass it off to junior level people who won't know what to look for. This task is boring, so we might be inclined to pass it down the ladder. It's also a great training exercise for the younger folks, but we need to fight that urge. The CM owes it to the owner, and that's why the owner has hired that CM. One more point, and it's an important one. Maintain the highest degree of ethics and fairness when reviewing the GC's estimate. We must be fair and have an initial mindset that the estimate is correct. Don't have a mindset of looking for something to strike out. The GC must be given a fair contract value. Owners routinely hand out pats on the back for struck out line items, but striking out items arbitrarily is not a fair business practice. This next negative stereotype is closely related and really a continuation of the last one. On negotiated projects, general contractors always have nuggets buried in the subcontractor scopes. The reality is, some general contractors do in fact utilize their bid instructions to hide nuggets in the subcontractor scopes of work. The bid instructions may direct subcontractors to include items of work that are duplicated in the GC's budget, duplicated among multiple subcontractors, or it might even be unnecessary work items. For instance, the general contractor might have each sub include a $5,000 allowance for final cleaning, when in fact the general contractor actually has the final cleaning covered in their own estimate. After the prime contract is executed, and for the most part, no one is looking, the GC will then issue deductive change orders to each subcontractor to move this money into their own budgets. The $5,000 per subcontractor in this example will add up to a sizable amount, all of which is just arbitrarily added to the general contractor's budget. To manage this issue, the CM needs to request copies of the bid instructions and read them. Anything the GC wants the subs to include beyond what's in the drawings and specs will always be in their bid instructions. They will never tell subs verbally to include additional costs in their bids, and a sub won't include anything unless it's in writing, and that works to our advantage. Copies of the bid instructions are routinely requested by CMs, and they are commonly skimmed over, but they are not always thoroughly reviewed, analyzed, and compared to other documents like the GC's estimate. As another example, subs may be directed to include an allowance of, say, 2% of their bid values for change order work, but the GC then uses this allowance to cover any mistakes they make, not owner change orders, even though the owner is paying this additional 2% via the subcontract values. This is a common nugget that effectively increases the general contractor's contingency value. Next, request copies of all subcontract agreements and read them. We should review the executed subcontract agreements to ensure there hasn't been any funny business between bid day and the time subcontract values are finalized. Reading all...
I just want to tell you, you're entitled to this because you are the CM. You are the representative of the owner. They have hired you to manage these contractors. So if the GC is expected to provide this information to you, he may not open his entire book unless it's a time and material job where they have to do that. But in most cases, it's you have the opportunity to look at subcontracts, purchase orders, those kind of things, those documents. you
Subcontract sounds like an insurmountable task given the amount of time we have in a day and the fact that they stack up about 2 feet high. But subcontracts are usually standardized with the exception of the scope attachment. And that's the most important thing to read. We don't need to read the boilerplate subcontract language and all the standard attachments 75 times each. Any nuggets that GC has asked the sub to include will usually be written into the scope attachments. Now this is a lot to read and thoroughly analyze, but as project leaders, CMs need to understand, monitor, and proactively manage the project. When a CM doesn't analyze these documents, he's neglecting his duties as the owner's representative. Now, let me point out something very important here. This may appear to be reactive management, but the reality is that we're not trying to catch the contractor in the act. By letting the GC know early on that we're going to read these documents, we're putting a deterrent in place. If they know we're watching, they know they'll be caught, so they won't try it. Proactively managing issues to eliminate problems before they occur is always the ultimate goal. Okay, let's move on and examine some ethical dilemmas. Here's ethical dilemma number 1. After competitive bids have been received, should the general contractor attempt to make a buy? Making a buy is when a general contractor requests an arbitrary bid reduction from a subcontractor after the bidding process has been completed. This occurs after the subcontractor has been verbally informed that they are the low bidder, but before the formal subcontract is issued. The answer is quite simply no. The reason, when bidders are competing against each other for a project, they will already be providing the lowest bid possible. When in direct competition, they are already taking every ounce of fat possible from their bids and submitting the absolute lowest price that they are comfortable with. This practice is used to pad a GC's contingency and is common on both hard bid and negotiated prime contract types. How this works is that the sub-bids are tabulated and the prime contract value is based upon those submitted bid values. Then, on a negotiated project in particular, the GC will wait until the prime contract is fully executed, at which time they will begin attempts to enter into subcontract agreements for lower values. Once a prime contract is executed, the reality is that the CM and owner are usually no longer watching. On negotiated projects, the CM can manage this issue by requesting copies of all fully executed subcontracts, and then, of course, verifying that those values match what was used to tabulate the prime contract value. However, on public works projects, the CM will unfortunately have less authority in this regard. Now, when the GC knows the CM will be reviewing the subcontracts, it's a deterrent. The GC will avoid this practice when they know they'll be caught later. So by letting the GC know they're being watched, we've prevented this unethical act from occurring. Once again, our goal is not to catch them in the act. It's to prevent the act from ever happening in the first place. Requesting copies of all fully executed subcontracts is a good proactive management practice. This practice might be used to strong-arm subcontractors. Whether expressly stated or implied by the way it's stated, asking subcontractors for money sends a signal that if they don't give the GC a portion of their money, they may lose even more by being treated unfairly through the course of the project. In other words, the subs that give money back will be given preferential treatment, and the subs that don't will be given less consideration. There's no other reason a sub would give money back. This isn't a charity, and they're not giving away money out of the goodness of their hearts. So whether expressed or implied, this is extortion. In the end, the owner is most likely to pay for it. Put yourself in the sub's shoes. They want to get that money back. When a GC strong arms a subcontractor, the sub will inevitably try to recoup this money by fighting fire with fire and inflating their change order requests as the project goes on. And those change order requests are usually directed to the owner. Generally, subs don't see beyond their contractual agreement with the GC to see that it's the owner they're actually recouping their money from. And even if they did, they may not care where the money comes from. They just want their money back. So in the end, not only will the owner overpay the GC for the higher subcontract values, but they will get hit in the pocketbook again when they end up overpaying for change order issues as well. And I'll tell you, when the subs do this, they're likely to get their money back and then some. Let's look at the numbers. For this example, let's assume a subcontractor has submitted a bid for $1 million. This sub has direct costs of $900,000, overhead of $50,000, and a 5% profit, which amounts to another $50,000, for a total of a $1 million bid. Because this subcontractor was in direct competition with other bidders to get the job, we know that this $1 million bid is the lowest value that they are comfortable with. Then the subcontractor gets a call from the general. The general contractor first lets them know that they're the low bidder, but then the general contractor demands a 1% buy. Fearing repercussions from the general contractor, the subcontractor gives in. After the general contractor makes a 1% buy, the subcontractor still has direct costs of $900,000. Their overhead is still $50,000. They aren't magically getting away from either of those. So it's their profit that takes the hit. This is a 20% reduction to the subcontractor's profit. Let's also look at these numbers from the general contractor's perspective. For this example, let's consider a $50 million prime contract for which $45 million of that is subcontracted. We'll say the general contractor's initial profit is 3%, or $1.5 million. Then they make their buys, and each sub gives back 1% of their bid value. Their initial profit of $1.5 million, plus 1% of the subcontracted $45 million, which is $450,000, equals $1.95 million. This is a 30% increase to the general contractor's profit. Let's take a second to discuss the commonly abused term, business decision. These examples we just went over, and the examples yet to come, are often referred to as good business decisions. For some reason that I can't explain, people tend to feel far less personal accountability for their actions when the label of a business decision can be placed on them. It's as if calling something a business decision magically makes everything okay. Some of my least favorite excuses when people act unethically are, it's just business and I'm just doing my job. The fact is that we are all personally accountable for everything we do and every decision we make, whether it be personal or professional. Okay, let's go to our next ethical dilemma. Ethical dilemma number 2. After negotiated bids are received, should we make attempts to lower the subcontractor pricing? Negotiated subcontracts are relatively common for the MEP and other primary trades on privately funded projects. The answer is yes. The reason is because there must be a series of checks and balances. Without competitive bidding as a means of ensuring fair pricing, we must thoroughly review and negotiate the subcontract values. Though CMs may have a working knowledge of subtrades, they're not going to be experts at every single one of them. For this reason, it's often a good idea to have a third-party peer review done. MEP proposals usually fall into this category, as those are very technical scopes of work. There's a lot of money on the table here, so we have to keep those subcontractors honest. But, and this is a very big but, reductions should never be arbitrary. Again, requesting arbitrary reductions is not a fair or ethical business practice. In fact, when asked for arbitrary reductions, the subs become defensive and will try to recover this money by fighting fire with fire and inflating their change order requests throughout the project. Okay, next let's look at ethical issues that center around subcontractors. Subcontractors are heavily reliant on others and don't fully control their own destiny. Subcontractors are experts in their own individual trades, but they are not experts in other trades. We rely on them for quality craftsmanship, timely performance, and of course, fair change order pricing. They rely on the design team for clear direction in the drawings and specs, and they rely very heavily on the general contractor for a clear division of work with the other subs, a fair schedule, and an efficiently run project. Subs are so heavily reliant on others that they are sometimes selective about which GCs, architects, and owners that they're willing to work with and will provide bids to. When a sub is less trusting of a GC, architect, or owner, the sub will either decline to bid on a project or increase their bid value to cover their risk and anticipated losses. This is why maintaining good relationships with subcontractors is so important. And now we're on to ethical dilemma number 6. Everyone else uses predatory bidding practices, so that means we have to also, right? Predatory bidding practices are what I call it when bidders search the bid documents looking for errors and omissions that they will be able to submit change order requests for 1 minute after being awarded the project. Intentionally withholding this information in an attempt to take unfair advantage of the owner is absolutely not acting in good faith. And of course, if you're not acting in good faith, you are not acting ethically. The answer is no. When an ethical bidder sees an error or finds an omission in the drawings that they know their competition will miss, there are things they can do. In fact, these things work for honest bid errors too. It doesn't need to be something that we know our competitors will intentionally leave out of their bids as an unethical, predatory bidding practice. These work for obscure items that we think our competitors will just quite simply overlook. When our competitors miss things, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it means their bids will be lower. We want to be sure that our competition does not miss anything, as the more work they pick up, the higher their bids are going to be. There's a general competitive mindset that people often have that you would never want to make your competition smarter, but the reality is that if making them smarter makes their bids higher, then making them smarter is actually a good thing. One thing we can do is to write stupid RFIs. Now, at face value, this might sound ridiculous, so let me explain. For this example, let's look at the perspective of a framing estimator who just realized that there's a note on the mechanical drawings calling for fire-rated gypsum board enclosures for much of the above-ceiling ductwork. He also sees that this work hasn't been coordinated with the architectural drawings. Now, this framing estimator knows that the other framing estimators that are bidding this project rarely look beyond the architectural series of drawings when preparing their bids. So he knows his competitors won't look at the mechanical drawings, and as a result, he knows that they're going to miss this work in their bids. That means that their bids will be significantly lower, and he's likely to lose the project to a company whose estimator just flat out missed this work in his bid. When bidding a project, we sometimes don't even know who all of our competitors are, but somehow we need to find a way to alert them of this work. One thing we can do is to write a stupid RFI. For example, he could send in an RFI that reads, "Please verify we are to include the fire-rated gypsum board duct enclosures as shown on mechanical drawings." This RFI is sent to the architect, then the architect is obligated to respond, and they do so in an addenda. Now, the framing bidders may not all find that obscure note in the mechanical drawings, but they will all read the addendas. So, when they see this in the addenda, they will all be sure to include those rated enclosures. There will be some framing estimators out there that just flat out missed it, and this will help raise their bids. Then, there will also be some framing estimators out there who saw this work, but know that industry standard practice is for the work to be coordinated with the architectural drawings. Therefore, they take the predatory tactic of leaving this work out of their bids in anticipation of getting a change order for it later.
I might have told you that I developed a friendship with a estimator who worked with another general contractor after we both left the general contractors we were working for, and we were working together at another company. And he told me flat out, he says, "I never looked at the drawings until I went to the pre-bid meeting because I knew you'd have a list of questions that you would ask. And it was all this kind of stuff." He said, "So why would I go to the trouble of even starting until I knew the stuff that you would bring up at the meeting would be in an RFI, and then I could start my estimate." The one problem with this is if you don't include it, then you have to argue that you're due it. Just because it's not maybe called out on the architectural drawings, the architects put notes in there that say, you are responsible for looking at other drawings to see what work might be there, not just the vision of work. So you stand a 50-50 chance of getting a change order or losing the money and still having to do that. So it's a double-edged sword. If you have a weak owner and a weak architect, maybe a weak CM, you can buffalo your way through. But if you have sophisticated counterparts that know what they're doing, chances are you wouldn't be able to get this.
Well, by issuance of the addenda, the need for this work was clearly called out to their attention, which means they won't be able to get a change order for it down the road. So, by submitting this stupid RFI, that change order opportunity has been stripped away from those unethical, predatory bidders. Now, the architect might respond to this dumb question by saying, "Yeah, of course, you big dummy. That's why it's in the drawings." But don't be discouraged. In writing the stupid RFI, you've done a good thing. In fact, the architect will only provide the condescending response because he doesn't realize why the stupid RFI was written. If you were to let the architect know that the intention of the RFI is actually to help them get better bids and to take a potential change order issue off the table, the architect will thank you for it, and for that matter, so will the owner. Next, we'll discuss ethical issues that are centered around the architect. The architect is our leader during the design phase. We rely on them for an exciting yet cost-efficient design. The entire project team relies heavily on them for complete and clear design documents. The architect relies on the general contractor for an efficient contract administration process, meaning RFIs and submittals need to be complete, receive a thorough review by the general contractor, and be provided in a timely manner. The architect relies on the owner for sufficient time to complete the documents and for minimal changes during the design process. Ethical dilemma number 8. Is it a perfectly acceptable practice to require that the contractor simply include allowances for any items that the design team hasn't finished prior to issuing the bid documents? This often occurs in the design team's race to the finish. The answer is no, because allowances are still billed against with change order pricing. Allowances are simply budgetary placeholders for anticipated future change orders. They do not prevent change orders. Allowances are commonplace, as we usually only concern ourselves with whether or not cost is covered, as opposed to whether or not we're using the best approach to cover the cost. The architect and general contractor may look like heroes when the unused portion of an allowance is returned to the owner, but the reality is that they would have paid less if the respective work was included in the base bids. The architect has an obligation to provide a cost-effective design. Completing the documents is their contractual responsibility, and they are costing the owner money when this allowance shortcut is taken. The use of allowances is not congruent with a cost-effective design. CMs need to monitor the design schedule and the design progress. For one reason or another, allowances won't always be fully avoidable, but CMs need to actively manage the design team to ensure they fulfill their responsibilities.
Architects hate that.
Instill in the design team that allowances are not an acceptable practice. When a design team member brings up the notion of an allowance, we must do our best to find a way to complete the design. And remember, the completeness of the documents is a reflection of the construction manager's leadership abilities. All right, let's move on to ethical dilemma number 9. To avoid change order requests, should we just call for the contractor to assume full responsibility for unforeseen conditions? Change orders for unforeseen conditions are arguably the owner's least favorite type of change order. They're very expensive, they create delays, and worst of all, you don't get anything tangible in return. With these types of change order requests, we're usually paying a lot of money to have something thrown away. As a result, the owner may pressure the architect to pass this responsibility on to the contractor via qualifications in the design documents. The answer is no. It is impossible for a contractor to place a firm lump sum value on an unknown quantity of work. The contractor can't foresee what's underground or otherwise concealed from view any better than anyone else. So put yourself in the general contractor's shoes. There's no way to price an unknown. In the end, this type of exculpatory language is usually determined to be unenforceable. It's the owner's project, and as painful as it might be, they must hold financial responsibility for the unforeseen conditions. There are things we can do to intelligently manage this issue, beyond simply adding an allowance to the project budget. We can employ an underground utility locator early in the design phase. Now, the locator won't find everything, but they'll find a substantial amount and will be able to plan for what they do find. We should always thoroughly review the historical drawings. Historical drawings aren't always complete or correct, but they may identify a few things. Perform selective potholing. Potholing locations are based on educated guesses. For example, imagine the project is currently a surface parking lot, but that it previously had a 2-story brick building. At the time the building was demolished for the surface parking lot, there would have been no reason to demolish and remove the foundations. For the purpose of a surface parking lot, leaving those foundations in place would be less expensive and do no harm. So it stands to reason that they're still there. So we can go dig a couple potholes and find out. The goal is to minimize change orders, as we cannot feasibly eliminate them. Diligent management of unforeseen conditions will not eliminate risk, but it will minimize it. This is all an owner can reasonably expect of the project team. If we have done our due diligence, receiving change orders in this case is not a sign of design error, so the architect and CM should have nothing to be ashamed of. Of course, explaining this to the owner may be difficult, but a reasonable owner will understand and appreciate the due diligence effort that the team did put forth. Ethical dilemma number 10. In the event of a document conflict, is it fair to always require that the contractor include the highest quantity and/or quality? This is very common language usually found in Division 1 of the specifications. The answer is no. The most prominent must cover.